Hey there, thank you very much for coming for our keynote address on this day of absence on campus. And without further ado, we want to extend a warm welcome to Ariel Luckey and thank you very much for showing up.
Right now, as we are gathered here at Evergreen, a young man is walking through the Arizona desert. He is someone's son and someone's father. He is thirsty. His eyes are dry and itch. Right now, it's 103 degrees in the desert. And he has been walking under the blazing sun since dawn and doesn't have any water left. His skin is burned. His lips cracked and bleeding. His feet are blistered and also bleeding. Every step takes its toll. The prickly pear tear at his ankles. The saguaro watch without concern. The air is so dry it sucks at his breath. His tongue is stiff and heavy in his mouth, and his legs feel like rubber. If he is lucky, he will still be walking when I finish this performance. When we leave this theater and stroll out into the beautiful afternoon, he will still be walking when you lie down in your beds tonight, in the comfort of your homes, and even if he makes it. If his heart doesn't stop from exhaustion, and his lungs and liver don't collapse in hyperthermia, if the extreme dehydration doesn't damage his brain, if he doesn't black out and take a final fall into the sand, even if he makes it to the pickup point at the motel in Welton, even if he finds a job and a floor to crash on, even if he survives the heat, he will still be in constant danger from ice. There's an old story that goes, in the beginning, God's presence was everywhere. In order to make room for the creation of the world, God contracted and resonated, "Let there be light." And 10 holy vessels came forth, each filled with primordial creative light. But the vessels were too fragile to contain such a divine light, and they shattered. And the holy shards were scattered like falling stars all over the world. The shards became embodied in all the elements of creation, where they remain, trapped in fragments, causing conflict and turmoil in our lives today. According to Jewish tradition, when a person does a mitzvah, an act of righteous love, of spiritual integrity, they illuminate the divine light within themselves and in others. And they release one of the trapped shards of light. When enough shards of light have been released and put back together, or remembered, the broken vessels will be restored, and tikkun olam, the healing of the world, will be complete. My name is Ariel Luckey, and I'm from Oakland, California. Yeah. I grew up in the house I was born in, raised in the middle of a city colored by accumulated culture clash, an urban borderlands and a lonely territory. The last stop on the Transcontinental Railroad, the birthplace of the Black Panthers, home of the hyphy movement and Occupy Oakland, a city of immigrants, where people speak 150 different languages, call home to every border, every corner of the globe. A patchwork city of hustlers, artists, everyday people repping the town and rooting for the underdog. A land of oak, logos, but not enough trees. New luxury condos, but not enough beds for the homeless. This is conflicted geography. I am a product of the public and the private schools, the Coliseum flea market and the foodie cafes, the blood-soaked streets, and the creeks of Redwood Park. I grew up in between the mansions of Piedmont and the projects, building bridges between cultures and trying to find my way. I've traveled the world without crossing city lines. Been to West African High Life, Thai Buddhist temple, Filipino barbecue, dance hall, dive bar, b-boy battles, Dia de los Muertos, Ethiopian weddings, pagan Earth Day rituals, Chinatown parades, jazz clubs, Baptist churches, Cupid bays, capoeira, holy yoga, asanas, acupuncture, needles, Ramadan, breakfast, Nadu, street freestyle ciphers, and indigenous sunrise ceremonies. I've been welcomed as a guest into so many different cultural spaces. But at the end of the day, that's what I am, a guest. And I've never really found a space that feels like my own, except sometimes in the music. Thank you. What's up, Evergreen? How you doing? What's up, everybody? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. My name is Ariel Luckey, and like I said, I'm from Oakland, California. Anybody ever been to Oakland? Make some noise, yeah? Yeah, you can make noise, it's okay. Yeah, we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to be performing some excerpts from my one-man show called Amnesia, and then we're also going to be talking, right? Dialogue, engaging in this topic, right? Migration, borders, citizenship, identity, who we are and where we come from, together. So, are y'all ready? Are you ready for this journey? We're going to be traveling, y'all. We're going to be traveling. And I heard like 3 of you. So let me try that again. Are y'all ready? Hey, now we're talking. It's reciprocity, right? We go back and forth. It feels good. So we're going to be traveling, right? And of course, we're talking about migration and borders. We're going to be traveling all over the globe and throughout history as well. So let's go on the journey. We start in Arizona. The young man I was referring to earlier is literal. There are people right now, as we're hanging out on this Wednesday afternoon, walking through the desert. This is a map put together by Humane Borders, Fronteras Compasivas, based in Tucson, Arizona. Every single red dot represents at least one death in the desert from 1999 to 2013. And many of these dots, because this is a big map, it's exploded outward, represent tens, if not hundreds, of deaths. So I start here in Arizona for a number of reasons. One is because it's a helpful reminder for me as a person who was born in this country out of citizenship and never have had to really question that. I take it for granted. It's a helpful reminder for me that there are people literally right now risking their life to get into this country. So this conversation isn't, hypothetical. It's not intellectual. It's not simply an academic exercise. And I know because I have white skin privilege, I have citizenship, it's easy for me to distance myself from that reality. So I start here as a helpful reminder for me that this is very real. It's very life and death. And that many people have family members who have crossed themselves or connected to these stories. The reason it all happens in Arizona is very intentional. The United States created a policy to build up the militarization of the border in California and Texas and New Mexico because they felt like the natural barrier of the desert would be a disincentive for people to cross. They looked at southern Arizona and they said, this is too hot, it's too far, it's too rough. People aren't going to be desperate enough to cross here. So they built up the militarization in all the other parts of the border. Of course, what happened is that created a funneling effect, right? So now more people cross here than in other places. And it says something to me about what they're leaving. That they're willing to risk their lives. They're going to hike in the desert for days, face all kinds of dangers in order to come into this country. So my journey with this whole story started in 2010. Has anybody remember or heard of Arizona SB 1070? Yeah, a handful of people? Great. So what SB State Bill 1070 was, it was passed and signed into law by then Governor Jan Brewer in 2010 in the state of Arizona. And basically what it said, that any police officer was kind of deputized to act as a Border Patrol agent. So if a police officer was driving or walking down the street or moving through a community and they saw someone who looked suspicious, they were legally had the right to pull them over, stop them, and demand to see their identification, their documentation, their paperwork. You can imagine what suspicious might mean in Tucson, Arizona, right, for a cop. And a lot of it had to do with skin color, right? The big critique, and many people got very, very upset when this bill passed. It turned Arizona in kind of a ground zero of the national immigration debate in 2010. And there was a whole storm of people all over the country debating in great detail this law. And of course, the critique was that what suspicious would be translated on in practice would be someone with brown skin, right? Someone who looked Mexican, someone who looked like an illegal, which of course is open to all kinds of subjectivities, right? My guess is that if I were walking down the street in Tucson, Arizona, a police would not stop me assuming suspicious that I might be an illegal immigrant, right? So this law was since, part of it was overturned in court. There's been a long kind of drawn out legal battle. But it really pushed the national immigration debate all over the country. And at the time, I was watching this all kind of unfold, and I was thinking about immigrants and Arizona and immigrants in Arizona, and I was like, wait a minute, like, hell of my family lives in Arizona, has lived in Arizona for generations, and like, you know, we're not native Arizonans, we immigrated there. But when people talk about immigrants in Arizona, they're not talking about my family. They're not talking about people who look like me. So I started kind of, raising some questions and ringing some bells. And I was like, I think I'm going to look a little more into this. How did my family get to Arizona? And what ended up happening is I found a few things out, many of which I'll share with you today. And I wrote a play about it called Amnesia, which explores these questions. What does race have to do with citizenship? What does geography have to do with identity? What is our responsibility to participate in the national conversation and policy making around migration and Border Patrol issues, right? So what we're going to be doing today, this afternoon, for the time that we have together, is I'm going to be sharing some of my own personal family history story, and also how that relates to the bigger, broader context and social systems of our society and the world. I'll invite you to reflect on your own stories and family's journeys, and we'll have some dialogue about it. But because I'm a performing artist, I love the art, I like to get into it through the theater. Y'all with me so far? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, good. Just checking. So if you're okay, I think I'll jump back into some theater. Does that sound all right with you? Yeah? Okay, good. Will you turn the volume back up to the original? Fantastic. So we go back to Arizona. I'm flying with my family to Phoenix for the weekend. From the sky, the desert looks empty. Mile after mile of rock and dirt, textured layers of reds, browns, and oranges. An occasional highway snakes across the valley, but mostly it's open land. and it looks hot. Out of nowhere, the city appears. Huge tracts of suburban housing cut the land in repetitive, symmetrical patterns. As we approach downtown, the sun reflects white off the skyscrapers and parking lots. This is a city of cars and palm trees where my cousin has chosen to get married. At the airport, we pick up a rental car and head over to the hotel, a massive beige building with Spanish arches and Southwest decor. The ceremony is outside, on a landscape patio, overlooking a fake lake and a dozen palm trees. It's a late September afternoon, and the weather is just perfect. The fountain in the fake lake provides the constant sound of falling water, and in the distance I can see the silver spray of sprinklers across the rolling green hills of a golf course. Some desert, huh? This is the largest family gathering of the Kivel clan in years. I haven't seen most of these folks since the slew of bar and bat mitzvahs about a decade ago. Growing up, we came to Arizona almost every year to visit my father's extended family, but it's been a while. The rabbi signals the start of the ceremony, and we all find our seats. He leads the bride and groom through the vows, the rings, the blessings of wine. My cousin and her fiance's love is obvious and really wonderful to celebrate. But the religious parts feel kind of dry, formal and scripted. I mumble through the Hebrew, and when prompted, stand and sit and stand and sit. It's like the wedding is a fancy American cake with a little Jewish icing. At the end, my cousin's new husband breaks the glass and everyone yells, Mazel Tov! After the ceremony, everyone rushes over to the open bar. The main attraction is a large ice sculpture the bartenders use to mix martinis. They pour the ingredients together on the top of this long horizontal slide made out of ice, and you hold your glass at the bottom to catch the iced martini. Now, I'm not a big drinker, but I had to try it, right? Fancy glass, little olive. I look around for something to clear my palate and see servers carrying silver platters of hors d'oeuvres filtering through the crowd. Yo, they got the little goat cheese and bell pepper cracker thingies. I'm like, hello. The man with the tray is dressed in caterer black and looks Latino. His eyes drop to the floor as he extends the platter. I grab a cracker and a napkin and mumble thanks. Just as I go to walk past him to get another drink, he turns to offer the platter to someone else and my arm bumps it. The tray clatters to the floor. And then everyone goes back to their conversations or whatever. Now, there's food all over. The waiter drops to his knees and starts cleaning up. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I bend over and try to help him. So we're scooping up all this crumbled cracker, goat cheese, pepper stuff. It's just a mess. Out of the corner of my eye, I see this guy in a fancy suit walking straight towards us. He has that I'm in charge kind of vibe and looks pissed. He stands over the server and under his breath says, Carlos, this is it. Next time you're fired. I stand up and say, no, sir, it was my fault. I bumped into him. A white smile flashes across the man's face, but doesn't reach his eyes. Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused you. Have you seen our martini ice sculpture? Let me get you a drink. He takes me by the arm and leads me back towards the bar. I look over my shoulder and see Carlos still kneeling, picking crackers off the floor. And for a split second, our eyes meet. Back at the bar, I order a white Russian and then walk out towards the fake lake. The sun is setting over the desert and the sky is the color of copper. I don't feel like dancing to the cheesy DJ or schmoozing with my cousins. We're all supposed to be happy and together, but I'm not feeling it. Everything looks so good on the surface. We're all dressed up and smiling and acting cool, but something about this whole thing. Something's missing. All of a sudden, I feel a chill and a presence. The Ruach, the Spirit. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that my great-great-granddaughter doesn't look lovely, because she does. And it is nice to see the family all together, but when I was a boy and the match was made, the klezmorim would play and everyone would dance until dawn. Hello? Who are you? Ich bin dein Ur-Ur-Zeda. Your father met me once, very briefly when you were just a boy. I've lived here in Phoenix for many, many years. I've been gone a long time until you called me back. I called you back? Okay. I guess I don't know what to say. Bah! You don't even know what you don't know. Let me ask you a question. I am your great-great-grandfather on your father's side. What is my name? I don't remember. Indeed. And what else has been forgotten? Do you know where I was born? How I came to live in this desert valley. Do you know where we come from? A pack of coyotes howl off in the desert, and every hair on my neck stands straight up. And then he's gone. It's over. His absence is as clear as his presence was. I listen to the fountain falling in the fake lake. The DJ is playing the Macarena. The first star has pierced the twilight. Where did my family come from? I really don't know. Eastern Europe somewhere? Eastern Europe somewhere? Where did we come from? Such a simple question should be a simple answer, right? I remember my father telling me it was my great-great-grandfather who came over to the States, but I don't know anything about the world he left behind, besides the fact that it was whack for Jews. I mean, poverty, pogroms, and hella cold. I mean, I've seen Fiddler on the Roof, but beyond that, I really don't know. Where did my family come from? And how did we get to Arizona? My family, immigrants in Arizona, almost 100 years ago. Thank you. So, I decided to find out. I wanted to know. You know, here I am. I'm already in my mid-20s. At the time, I consider myself a pretty educated person. I went to elementary school, I went to middle school, I went to high school, I went to college, I went to, you know, how much of my life have I studied things? And yet, I didn't know where my family came from. That was kind of crazy. And once the question occurred to me, it just kind of hung out. You ever had that, right? Where like a question doesn't leave you alone? It's like it's knocking on the door, wants to be answered. So I started doing research, genealogy, family history. I started interviewing elder relatives, talking to my dad, talking about his great uncle, talking to anybody I could. And online, there are amazing resources, right? Everything all over the world is getting digitized, it's getting networked, right? You can do things online that 20 years ago would have felt like mission impossible. And I found the name of the village where my great-great-grandfather was born and raised. It's called Lupcha. It's right in the area historically known as the Pale of Settlement, the very westernmost part of Russia, Eastern Europe, right in this mix of places. Over the last several hundred years, this area has been a part of Prussia, a part of Poland, a part of Russia, a part of the Soviet Union, a part of 6 different kingdoms and queendoms. The borders have gone back and forth, right, as people have fought. And Ashkenazi Jews have lived in the middle of it, pretty much most of that entire time. You see Minsk there in the middle. That's Minsk now. It's the capital of Belarus. And Lupcha is a 2-hour drive southwest of Minsk. Belarus is a whole other trip. They're still very, very dictatorial and very close ties with Russia. But this is the village. And as these questions kept knocking on my door, kept bothering me, I realized that I actually wanted to go there. I actually needed to go there. So I raised the money, and 3 years ago now, my brother and I went to Lupcha. This is Lupcha. That says Lupcha in Russian. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's like at the end of the road, as in like the road stops and doesn't go anywhere else because there's nowhere to go. This tiny little town. These tiny little houses that are very colorful, but also very dilapidated. So my brother and I went, halfway around the world. And we got to spend a couple days walking around this small town where our family came from. This is a picture of the cemetery. I mean, not the cemetery, of the synagogue, the building that was the synagogue before World War II. Tangentially, although not really at all, 99% of the population, Jewish population in this town, was murdered in the World War II. So there are no Jews there today. But at least we got to go to the place. This is the Jewish cemetery in that town. And it was pretty profound for me, having grown up in this country as like a generic white person, right? Without a real clear, like I said, idea of where my family came from, besides over there, Eastern Europe-ish. But now I had a specific place. And I got to go there, and I learned the history of that place. And I got to imagine my great-great-grandfather's life as a kid growing up there. And his parents, right? My family had been there for generations. So let's go. Y'all still with me? Yeah. Okay. Just checking. Time traveling. Let's go to Lupcha. Come. It's time you remember. This is my home. Well, it was my home. I'm leaving. I'm going to Kiev, the largest city in the Pale. My cousin, Shlomo, was a student in the gymnasium there, and he says that the Jew, God willing, can make enough money to put food on the table. The tailor, Mendel, says something about needing special residency papers to live there, but what does he know? Does he live in Kiev? No. He lives right here, where there is no jobs, no food, and between you and me, no nice-looking young ladies. Don't get me wrong, this was a decent place to grow up, despite the cold and the hunger and the occasional problem with the goyim. Us boys used to run to the open fields and swim in the Neiman River all summer. We made a life out of what God gave us. But then everything changed. It was the heart of winter. Right before my bar mitzvah, the tree branches hung heavy with fingers of ice. I was sitting in the cheder studying when the butcher Ephraim came running with the news. The Tsar has just been assassinated. You can imagine the uproar, the racket, everyone with questions, stories, something to say. For my fellow students and I, it was at the time maybe not such bad news. We were dismissed from school for the day and got to run around the woods in the snow looking for firewood. 4 months later, I woke up to the sound of screaming. The goyim were going crazy, burning everything, beating people. It was chaos. My family fled to my uncle's house in Dilyatich and stayed there 3 days until it settled down. When we came back home, we found half our house burned to the ground. At least my father's tallis and tefillin had survived. And we were the lucky ones. I will not burden you with the names of the dead. But what are you going to do? When they weren't killing us, it was a good life.
Jewish population almost doubles in Kiev. St. Petersburg Press.
Dirty Yids take over our city. The Kievian.
Illegal Jews caught in police hunt. The Bessarabits paper.
Coming home late one night from the tailor shop, I hear the sound of a dog barking and marching footsteps. The Oblavi, a police hunt. My apartment is only a few blocks away, so I start running. I have to get off the street. I don't have enough time to get home. I pound on the first door I can find. Help! It's an aide. Please let me in. By the grace of God, the door opens. A man I know from shul grabs me by the collar and yanks me into the house. Quick, open to the attic. He pushes me into the dark. I bang my shin on something hard, but dare not make a sound. A ladder, a small climb, a panel sliding shut. The sound of my heart hammering in my chest. The police pound on the door and then barge into the house, demanding to see everyone and their residency papers. They line the family up one by one, asking them where they work, where they go to school, is anyone else in the house. I'm paralyzed, barely breathing, for fear I will make a sound. Finally, after what feels like eternity, I hear the door slam, and there is quiet. I spend the night in the attic, too terrified to leave, too terrified to sleep. If they had caught me, I would have spent the night in jail and been deported from Kiev by noon the next day. I've had enough. This is not living. I can't keep my job or go to school. There is no future for us here. I've heard there's a way to get out through Hamburg. And my brother Jacob went last year and writes that he is well and working, making good money. I'm going. I'm going to America. Thank you. So, does that sound familiar? to anybody? You need residency papers to prove that you're a legal citizen of a place. At the time, Kiev was the biggest industrial city in the Pale of Settlement. All the Jews in the surrounding countryside were dirt poor for the vast majority of them. Kiev had economic opportunities, educational opportunities, quality of life. So people were sneaking in, even though they didn't have the right paperwork. Then they were being hunted down and forced to prove that they had the right paperwork. If they didn't have the right paperwork, they were arrested and deported. What does that sound like? ICE raids, right? Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Department of Homeland Security deals with immigration, right? And they're split into two organizations, Border Patrol and ICE, Immigration, Customs Enforcement. Border Patrol deals with the borders all around the country. Within a certain distance, might be 100 miles, closest to the border. ICE deals with everything else inside, right? They work together, but they have different jurisdiction. So here I am doing family history research. I'm like, this is a cool genealogy project. I want to learn more about Eastern Europe. I want to learn more about where my family came from, why they came to this country in the first place. You know, why does someone like up and leave their family, their home, the world that they know, travel around the country, around the world to go somewhere else? That's a pretty big decision. Why would you do that? So I was trying to learn, and I come across this story about the Jews in Kiev. This was, of course, in a context of anti-Semitic violence all over the region. This is a picture from 1881. There were waves of pogroms. Pogroms is a fancy word that means a bunch of people go crazy and start beating up on Jews. Murdered, burning the Jewish quarters down the neighborhoods, stealing their property. Just crazy. Mob violence, right? You can imagine some of the lynching scenes from the South, but this is towards the whole community. Like it happened in the South towards African Americans at various points of this country's history. These are all bodies. This was the climate, right? Jews had already experienced, hundreds of years of persecution from Christians, Russian, Eastern Orthodox folks, and also in European countries. So there was already poverty and persecution happening. But after the Tsar was assassinated in 1881, the rise of anti-Semitism skyrocketed. And there was these waves of pogroms happening. There was one that happened in Lubcha when my great-great-grandfather was 13 years old. So I try to imagine what that would have been like for him, right? In this small village that he grew up. He probably knew every single person in the entire village, right? Maybe 1,000 people. And then he's 13, the year of his bar mitzvah, the year he's becoming a man. The Russians rise up and murder Jews, burn down their houses and stores. I start to understand a little bit, right, why he might want to get out of that picture. So this was the bigger context of what was happening at that time. And specifically the raids for the Jews in Kiev. They described the anxiety of the Jewish population in Kiev because most of them weren't able to get the legal residency papers required to live there. It was almost impossible. You had to pay someone outlandish money or you had to know someone on the inside. And for a long time, the local authorities and the police had looked the other way and allowed it to happen. But after 1881, the scrutiny intensified, the political pressure shifted, and these raids started happening all over the place. Now again, I have U.S. citizenship. I've never been scared to have my house broken into in the middle of the night, having to prove that I'm a legal person to be where I am. I have no idea what that's like. My great-great-grandfather left when he was 19 years old. Said goodbye to his parents. He never saw them again. He said goodbye to Lupcha. He never went back. And he came to New York City. This is a picture of Castle Garden. It's right there at the very southern tip of Manhattan, just below Wall Street. It's no longer an immigration center. But in 1889, when my great-great-grandfather came through, this was New York's port of immigration. It was right before Ellis Island opened. Ellis Island opening was a pretty big deal. It was the moment, it happened in 1891 or 92. And it was the moment where the federal government said, you know, this whole immigration thing, we should probably be in charge. Prior to that, it had been individual states dealing with immigration. So Castle Garden was the New York point of entry. But there were multiple points of entry around the country at different states. And the federal government was like, you know, we should probably take over this immigration thing. And they opened Ellis Island. Ellis Island, of course, became the port of entry for, you know, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of immigrants over the last 100 years. In New York, in the 1890s, Lower East Side was a Jewish community. This is where sweatshops really started, in the tenements of the Lower East Side. So my great-great-grandfather moved there and got work sewing in the sweatshops. You know, it's an interesting relationship between labor and immigration, right? And if you look at the history of immigration, like the Braceros program and various things, the folks in charge, the politicians, have found lots of loopholes. When they need cheap labor, they'll bring a lot of folks in to work. And then when they don't need cheap labor, then all of a sudden, it's very important to tighten up, right, around immigrants. So at the time, there was a boom, industrial boom in New York City. And for Eastern Europeans, there was an opportunity to come into this country. Anybody want to go to New York? Yeah? Let's go to New York. I work and I work and I work, never ceasing. My arm and my iron, I am a machine. No feeling, no thought, and no reason I'm working. Just iron the garments from collar to seam. Day after day, the minutes, the hours, they slip through my fingers like lost grains of sand. Just ironing, on without tiring. I am a machine now, no longer a man. The clock on the wall calls another day over. I crawl to my tenement, hungry and weak. A room with 10 others, all filthy and smothered. A dry crust of bread is all I have to eat. I sleep on the floor with the rats and the roaches. But only till dawn, and I'm back on my feet. Back to the iron, there is no escaping. Another day's aching, another day's heat. I'm coughing and wheezing. The smoke's hard I'm breathing. The cold that is burning hot blackens my lungs. It heats up the iron that presses the garment. My breath comes in heavy. I'm no longer young. I work and I work and I work, always wheezing. My chest feels a squeezing, can't get enough air. My heart pounds like thunder. I start to slip under. The world fades to black and I'm lost in despair. We left New York the next month. I just couldn't breathe there. I had met a young woman from Minsk with a sparkle in her eye, Fanny Cohen. She worked in the clock factory with my sister's husband. He arranged for us to meet, and 3 weeks later, we were married. We took a train all the way across the country to a dusty little city called Los Angeles. I used all my savings to lease a small second-hand clothing shop on Temple Street. We lived in a single room in the back. And that's where my first son, Simon, was born. A business was decent, and I started saving everything I could. This was my chance to make it in the Golden Medina, the Golden Land. Thank you. All right, so we've been talking about them. Here they are. It's my great-great-grandparents. Hyman Kavelovich and Fanny Cohen. This is one of maybe 5 pictures that I have of them. It was taken in New York in the early 1890s, maybe on their wedding day or right around then. And they didn't stay in New York long, 5 or 6 years, before they traveled west. It was really Hyman's asthma that kept him. You know, New York is humid, super humid and hot. And they were burning coal to heat the irons in the sweatshops where he worked. So his lungs just couldn't handle it. He needed hotter air and drier air. So the Southwest was where they resettled. Which, when you think about it, is a whole nother migration. They had already traveled, right, from Belarus, Eastern Europe, all the way across the continent of Europe, and then all the way across the Atlantic to get to the United States. And now they were traveling from all the way, New York City, all the way, this is in the 1890s. Trains were brand new. These newfangled things called the locomotives get you across the country in several days. It's only because of empire that they didn't cross any national lines or borders, traveling the 3,000 miles from New York to Los Angeles. That's only because of empire. You understand what I'm saying? They went through ecosystems, political and cultural territories, all kinds of things. But it was all one country. This is where they arrived. Dusty little city called Los Angeles. So, here's the thing about immigration. no matter where you're coming from, and I now knew a lot more about where they were coming from, you're still arriving at a place. It's not just a blank slate, right? Every place has its people, its history, its context. And nobody talked about this in my family in terms of Los Angeles, but Los Angeles has a pretty extensive history, right? This is a map of Native American tribes superimposed over a normal map of Los Angeles. You can see LA up there, Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, all the different neighborhoods, right? Long Beach. So when my great-great-grandparents, fleeing poverty and persecution, fleeing, looking for a healthy place to live and an opportunity, they didn't have much, and they came out west, but they already arrived in a colonized landscape, right? There was the Spanish missions and soldiers who had started in the 1700s, the 1800s, part of Spain, and then it was part of the nation of Mexico, and then it was part of California, the gold rush, et cetera, right? Here's one of the things that's missing. It's a gigantic and ridiculous omission in the national debate on immigration. This is one of those key pieces of context. The United States is a colonial empire. So where does the authority to determine who can come and go come from? Right? It's an inherently political question. This is a picture of the United States. The green areas represent Native American reservations, which all told represent 2% of the land base of this country. If you flip that number around, you know that 98% of the land base was stolen from the Native American tribes and nations who have lived here for the previous thousands of years, right? What is this context, this historical context? How does that change the conversation about immigration? What does that mean? None of the white folks who are now staunchly anti-immigration are indigenous to this land. When I watch the news, right, I go check out what's going on in Arizona. Arizona right now, they're a whole new round of bills and legislation, super anti-immigration. And Arizona is interesting because it was the 48th state to incorporate in 1912, just over 100 years ago, right? That's before Alaska and Hawaii. The 48th, it was the last continental state to become a state. And even when Oregon and Washington and California had people, Arizona was still empty. Why? Because it's a desert, right? It's a desert. You got to be crazy to go live in Arizona. So all of those white folks who now live in Arizona have only been there for a couple generations. They might have been technically in the country, but they were not actually from Arizona. The myriad of Native American tribes, right? The Apache, the Tohono-O'odham, the Dene, who are all still living, and Arizona has a huge Native American population. You can see the green, right? Some of the biggest reservations in the country are down here in Arizona. If anyone has the authority or the, position to be able to talk about who can be there, one might think Native Americans have some perspective. My great-great-grandfather became a citizen in I think that says 98. You can see his name, Hyman Kivel, right there. course, they take Kavelovich and they bring it down to kibble. It's part of the assimilation process. I found, I remember how I said I'd done a bunch of family history research, and I talked to my grandfather's sister-in-law, his brother's wife, lives in Tucson, Arizona. And last time I was out there, I was asking all kinds of questions. We were digging out boxes of family pictures, and I brought my notes, and we were like, okay, this person moved over here, and they were related to there, and da-da-da. And, we had a really interesting conversation. And after I left, like a month later, I get this email. She says, you lit a bug, and I started doing poking around, and I was cleaning out the back of this closet, and I found a box. And in this box is a piece of paper that's Hyman's original certificate of citizenship. It's 118 years old, this piece of paper. It's been sitting in a box in her closet for like 45 years, right? But she happened to be digging because I was there and I was asking questions, and then she found it and she sent it to me. And it was in terrible condition, but I had it restored. This is a picture of it, obviously, but this is the real piece of paper. And this is what I found most kind of compelling about this whole document. In the corner, it says, "Be it remembered." Don't forget. You were not always a citizen. This is me, right? My family was not always citizens of this country. And my great-great-grandfather was able to become a citizen at a time when lots of other people were being excluded. So what does it mean to be a citizen in the United States? Who gets to be a citizen and who decides? How does that have to do with race and geography? So we're going to zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture. I've been telling you my own family stories and narrative, but let's look at the bigger picture. The very first legislation that the government passed about citizenship was the Naturalization Act of 1790. This is early, right? The country is a baby, right? 1776, Declaration of Independence. It was just getting started. So then it became this question: who's a citizen? How do we decide that and regulate it? From the very beginning, and of course you remember who the founding fathers were, right? They were white men, they were Christian, landowning, educated, right? Very particular demographic. And they defined citizenship as free white persons with good moral character. This is the language of this law. Free white persons. So, a couple things. Number one, citizenship has always been racialized, right? From the very beginning, it was defined in racial terms. It is about race. So, we're talking about things that are missing in the way we think and talk about national immigration. If we're not really honestly addressing race, then we can't have a real conversation about immigration and citizenship in this country, right? Because from the very beginning, it's been defined as free white persons. And I would propose that there might be folks out there in the country who still have this vision of what it means to be a U.S. citizen, right? Free white person. With good moral character. Now, what do you think they meant by that? They meant Christian, right? There was a specific set of values in Puritan Christian context, of which many of the founding fathers in the first generation of politicians and legislators were. So when they say good moral character, they have a very specific idea of who that includes and who it does not, right? So this is the beginning. And it's still being very hotly debated, right? You tune into all kinds of current events. Has this changed? And how has it changed? Well, this happened. You can't really talk about immigration without talking about forced migration, right? And for all of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of African American folks who were brought to this country against their will and forced into labor. They were not considered citizens, of course, at that time. They weren't really even considered people, right? 3/5 of them counted even for population census. This is another important piece of the conversation because it was racialized. Because they were African, they were not allowed to be a citizen until 1868. This is an important moment, not only because it ended slavery after the Civil War, but it defined part of what we understand as citizenship that has lasted until today. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution said that any person born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen. And that's still on the books. If you're born in the country, you are a citizen. That's kind of a cornerstone of the whole thing, which is a very radical shift, right, from free white persons with good moral character. A few years later, in California, and I don't know, I'm curious if there are similar laws, if there were similar laws in Oregon and Washington. Yeah, that's what I thought. Thank you. But in California, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the government was in the process of legislating where people could and could not come from, right? They would roll out a globe or a map of the world, say people could come from here but not there, there but not here, this many from there and not only this many from there, right? And it was very much geography and race. What's striking to this about, to me, is the language. Right? This is from a newspaper. Hip hurrah. Chinese excluded. And at the bottom, the white man is on top. This was, of course, after the gold rush, and there was a lot of economic competition. The Chinese Americans in California at that time were doing very well entrepreneurially and business, and they were threatening and competing with white business owners. And so the business folks put pressure on the government to not allow them to continue to come in. This is another big piece, a building block of this picture, Mexican-American War. The entire Southwest, up until 1846, was a part of the nation of Mexico. Much of that had been a part of the colony of Spain previous to that. And of course, throughout all of this time, there were indigenous, autonomous native nations and tribes. And I won't get into the details, but essentially the United States government, with the banner of manifest destiny, from sea to shining sea, wanted to take over the whole country and basically picked a fight. Long story short, picked a fight with the nation of Mexico, won the fight, and took this land. This was a third of the country of Mexico at the time. And a huge, just vast territory, right? This is where the phrase, we didn't cross the border crossed us, comes from, right? Because Latino folks had been living in this region for over 100 years. Spanish was the first language, a European language spoken in the United States. This is an interesting thing. There were European explorers on the West Coast in the 1500s. But if you go to a high school U.S. history book, where will they start U.S. history? In New England, right? The story of the Pilgrims. Why? That's not, I mean, even if you don't start with Native American history, right? If you're simply starting with European colonization as a starting point, it would actually make more sense to start with the Spanish explorers and colonizers on the West Coast in the 1500s. But and James Lowen, he wrote Lies, My Teacher Told Me. He does great scholarship about the skewed, distorted perspectives of history and why all the history books start with the Pilgrims in New England in the 1600s. Anyway, I digress. This war increased United States territory drastically and turned all of these people. They had everyone except Native Americans, who at that point were not citizens, but Mexican Americans in this territory were given the opportunity to become a citizen. So again, the idea, and of course this is where Arizona is, this is where Los Angeles is, the idea that my great-great-grandparents could travel from New York to Los Angeles and stay in the same country is a direct result of the empire building, right? It's the colonization of more and more territory. And that just it has to be acknowledged as part of this conversation about what migration means. You know, of course, there are also native tribes down here. Traditional territory crossed going back and forth, north and south across that border. So the politicians who negotiated the Glasden Purchase, which is that super dark area on the very bottom of Arizona there, they were in a room with a map, drawing lines on a piece of paper, and they drew the national border right between the To'ano Adams indigenous tribal territory. They have sacred sites on both sides. They have family members on both sides of the border. And now all of the militarization that's happening happens right in the middle of their indigenous land, right? Native Americans are a very fascinating situation in this whole picture because for a long time they weren't considered native citizens. They were indigenous, autonomous members of their tribe. And it wasn't until actually this picture was taken in 1924 that Native Americans became citizens of the United States. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? The picture that I'm hoping to paint is that citizenship and migration is racially determined. It's a social and political construct. It's been different over time, right? In terms of the chronology. So the idea that we just have a country and it's just a country full of immigrants and we're all here and everyone else out there can't come in here. You know, the terms that folks in the mainstream media and a lot of places talk about it are very, very simplified and very, very sanitized from the violent and very nuanced and complex history of migration and citizenship in this country. Does that make sense? Yeah? You all with me? Yeah? Okay. So this is the bigger picture. I'm going to bring it up to a couple of current events, and then I'll give you a chance to talk with each other. So there was a lot of hope a couple years ago. And I just want to acknowledge, I'm skipping all over the place, right? We have just a few minutes. You know, if we had like a year-long course, we could go in detail and cover all of these things in like extensive process. But, you know, I'm just trying to paint broad brushstrokes to give us a context, a starting place for the conversation, right? A couple years ago, there was a fair amount of hope and optimism that we would have something called comprehensive immigration reform. Under President Obama, the opportunity to reform the entire immigration system. The policing, the policy, the detention, the jailing, right? The whole piece was up on the table. And, you know, Republicans and Democrats and everyone was chiming in and weighing about it. And DACA was created in 2012, which gave some people some kind of path towards deferred deportation. That's how optimistic that was. It was not a path to citizenship. It was not applicable to everybody. But if you fit these, 10 criteria and you jump through these 4 loops, then you might not get deported today. You could literally defer. That's what DA, deferred action. You could defer your deportation for later. Procrastination, right? And everyone was hopeful. Okay, this is the first step. This is great. Maybe we'll go farther. And Obama chose to focus on health care. The Republicans were like shutting it down completely, and nothing happened. Basically, nothing happened, except that everything happened. The continued system, exactly the way it was set up, has continued. People are deported all the time. ICE, the Border Patrol, right? Like, it's all happening. The change didn't happen. And that brings us to today. So here we are. It's, a presidential election year. The other layer of complexity is, Syrian immigrants, folks from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, and India. Political refugees, right? People who are fleeing extreme violence, extreme poverty, absolutely horrible lives, are trying to find a safe place for their families, are trying to, just live, right? And I have to say that having done the research, learning my family's story, learning Hyman's story, the little village that he came from in Eastern Europe, the suffering, the oppression that he faced as a Jew in Russia, the trials and tribulations that it took for him to get to this country, the opportunities that he had because he was European and had white skin when he got here. I have a different relationship to this conversation now. Because it's not this abstract, what should we do with these poor people? All these poor immigrants over here, they need help. I see myself in this picture, in my family's trajectory, right? I don't even have anything to say about that. But it is the context, right? And you could say that there's a fair amount of opportunity right now, given the macro politics that are at play. So I've been talking a lot, and I've shared a lot of information. What I like to do is give you a chance to talk to each other. So if we could bring the house lights up real quick, and I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes to turn to a neighbor, hopefully someone you don't know. Push yourself out of your border, your comfort zone. Introduce yourself. And I want you to share, number one, what's on the top of your mind right now? Seeing this performance and presentation, this information, what are you thinking about? What are you feeling? And number two, is there any part of your family immigration story that you want to share? Do you know where your family comes from? Do you know how they got here? Obviously, in a nutshell, right? So you'll have 2 to 3 minutes each. I'll tell you when you're about halfway through your time. Just try to pick one person so each person has more time to talk, and jump right in. All right, go ahead and wrap up your conversations. Thank your partners for sharing and listening. I'm absolutely positive there is more to say. And if nothing else, I hope that this presentation just, points to the complexity of these issues, the enormity of this question, this problem, and this set of circumstances. And if it wasn't already complicated enough, I have a few other things to add to the conversation. We haven't talked about economics. And that's actually kind of a big deal. This is a picture in the Ciudad de Mexico, DF, capital city, of an anti-globalization protest. And what you have is campesinos carrying a giant puppet ear of corn. Now, why would they do that? They are protesting what has been, very friendly terms, globalization. Specifically, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which was passed in 1994, signed by President Bill Clinton, very much supported by his wife Hillary Clinton, who has been very pro-trade in these big trade agreements. And what NAFTA did, the North American Free Trade Agreement, North American, Canada, United States, and Mexico, what it did is that it allowed for trade to cross the border. What do you know? Back and forth between those countries. One of the things that happened after NAFTA was that a lot of United States-based companies said, hey, look, there's Mexico down the road. They have lower environmental regulations. They have lower labor standards. And look, they're right there. Let's move our factories down there, make all of our stuff really cheaply, and then bring it back and sell it in the United States for the same high prices. We can make so much money. Isn't that great? So part of folks who critique NAFTA say that it was one of the beginning of the process of undermining the middle class, right, and the industry, right? A lot of the 20th century United States was known as industrial, right? We made things in this country. And NAFTA was a part of exporting the manufacturing to Mexico. So a lot of people in the United States lost their jobs. A lot of those stable, union, middle-class, blue-collar jobs were gone. And it created these jobs in Mexico, but they were low-paid, they were dangerous, they were exploited, et cetera, lots of complexities. The other thing that it did was it created opportunities for U.S.-created products to find new markets. And this is where corn comes in. Because the United States grows a lot of corn. You ever been to Iowa or Kansas? Now soy is actually kind of is like soy and corn and soy. But man, we grow a lot of corn. We got a lot of cornfields in this country. And so much corn that they start putting corn into everything, right? So there's corn syrup and all kinds of things that should not have corn syrup. And they're like, wow, we are growing more corn than we can sell. Where else can we sell it? Mexico. Let's sell our U.S.-grown corn in Mexico. Well, the U.S. corn is subsidized by the government. It's become all agribusiness, big farming corporations. They get tax breaks. They get all kinds of subsidies from the U.S. government so that they can grow massive amounts of corn very cheaply. It's all now genetically modified. So it's GMO corn that's grown very cheaply in mass. And trade agreements like NAFTA allow it to be exported to Mexico and sold very, very cheaply. Now, some of these campesinos or farmers who came to DFA to protest are from the region of Oaxaca, right? Southwestern Mexico. And in Oaxaca, they grow purple, deep purple corn and bright electric blue and incredibly glowing red corn, right? They have these heirloom corn varieties that they have been growing for generations in their family, generations. Small, autonomous, local farmers cultivating these heirloom varieties of corn. And that's their livelihood. So, what happens When the farmer comes to sell his local organic heirloom variety of purple corn to the market in Oaxaca, and a flood of very, very cheap GMO corn floods the market, they can't make a living anymore. They can't continue to farm and grow their corn anymore. They can't feed their children anymore. The farmers are out of work and they're desperate. And what do? They think about traveling north, coming to the United States, maybe working as a migrant farmer in a cornfield in Iowa. Iowa has a huge population of undocumented folks, people who don't have legal paperwork. Because what they do when they get to this country is they end up working in the fields, which is like backbreaking, hard physical labor day after day, with no health care, no pension, no retirement, no job security. Or they work in the meat packing factories, right, where the animals are slaughtered and butchered and packed, right? They do often the most dangerous, the most physically challenging, the most risky jobs in our economy. And why? Why would they even come here? Why would they leave their home, their families, to come here? Because they need to make money to feed their children. And they can't anymore because of trade agreements like NAFTA and the subsidies in corn. This is just one picture of a bigger process, right? But there are economics that play. People describe it as a push and a pull, right? What is pushing people out of their home communities and what is pulling them to the United States? And the folks who are like corporate corn farmers are getting paid. You know what I'm saying? They're living large. The folks who are the owners of the farms, Kellogg's and all those big companies, they're getting paid. The other folks who are getting paid is the private prison industry. There are actually two prison systems in this country, and they've both been privatized. There's, what you normally think of prison for quote-unquote criminals, right? Folks who have broken some kind of law. They did a drug, they stole something, et cetera, et cetera. They break a law, they get tried and sentenced, and they go to jail. That's one prison system, and it's been massively privatized, as in a private corporation builds, runs, and operates the prison in contract to the U.S. government. The government contracts them to run the prison. The second system of prison, which has actually exploded in the last 2 decades, is what is very cleanly called detention centers. These are the prisons that people who don't have documents go to. They are prisons, even though they're called detention centers. They are filled with people whose only crime is that they don't have the legal paperwork that they need. This didn't used to be a criminal offense, right? Now we're getting into a little law theory here. This, we're all over the place today, right? Migration, crossing the border illegally, used to be a civic offense. This is a political choice, right? Is it civic? Is it criminal? There are big implications for both. It's since, in the last 10 years, has become a criminal offense. It is a crime to be in this country without the right proper paperwork. And of course, as you can imagine, there is more severe consequences, right? So these two prison systems, the criminal justice prison system and the detention center for folks without documentation prison system, and they're everywhere. There are big, giant prisons in the state of Washington for undocumented folks. So some of those folks who cross the border in southern Arizona and get arrested, get caught by the Border Patrol, come up to Washington State to serve their time before they're deported. So that's in your backyard, right? Like this is not that far away. Both of these prison systems have been privatized, which means there's private corporations. And you know what a corporation is supposed to do, right? The number one thing is make money, right? So what happens when there's a whole segment of the population whose fundamental business plan is based on filling their prisons? The more people in their prisons, the more money they make because they have negotiated contracts with the United States government. The government pays them per bed, per occupied bed. It is their vested interest to have those prisons full as much as possible for as long as possible. And these are big corporations. Corrections Corporations of America make millions and millions of dollars every year. Better believe they have lobbyists, right? They're talking to Hillary Clinton. They're talking to Donald Trump, right? Just like every major corporation in this country, they're looking out for their vested business interests. It just so happens that their business interest is based on locking people up for not having the right paperwork, right? So again, we're talking about these different complex components of what it means to be a citizen. You can't have this conversation without talking about race. I don't think you can have this conversation without talking about Native American sovereignty and the land that this whole country is built on, the original citizens. You can't talk about this conversation without talking about economics and the business interests and what could potentially be a conflict of interest in the public good, right? In terms of what makes good public policy. Y'all with me? Okay. We're moving towards closing. I just have a few more pieces I'd like to share with you, and then we'll have a short chance to conversate. Will you go ahead and roll that last track? I'm going to go back in to Amnesia. I peer into the past, but all I can see is a white mist. I stare until my eyes hurt, my hands clenched. The only way forward is to go back. Research itself is a pilgrimage, combining the latest tools of 21st century technology with the ancient rituals of asking questions, prayer, and intuition. There it is. Maybe I will find what I seek. Maybe I will learn to live with the unanswered. Within the white mist, shapes emerge slowly and with effort. Shards of bone, a birth date, a place on the map, a last name, a skeleton of knowledge, shaky and incomplete. Everything transformed by time. So much has already been lost, bleached. But the questions hover in ceiling corners, whispering my name. I lie awake at night, trying to remember stories I've never heard. Where do my people come from? I need to find out. My hands are clenched into a tight fist. I'm staring hard, but I can't see beyond the white mist. Lost inside this identity crisis. Inherited assimilation, family sacrifices. I struggle to survive this cycle of violence, defiance of a history of tyrants. America, the Jewish immigrants arrived with a deep tradition held inside us, but the cultural vibrance of Yiddish collided with the genocidal system of American whiteness. My life is a collage of compromises. A journey to find who my tribe is, and while I'm grateful I'm alive with the words to write this, what we lost was priceless. I search for song within the silence, hear the whispers of clarinets and violins. My ancestors' guidance, memory, history, poetic license. And what amnesia? Amnesia, amnesia, amnesia. What happens when we forget who we are and where we come from? When the cultural narratives and our public policy are based on historical amnesia. Yeesh. Yeesh. We are descendants of white immigrants in a nation that's been ill since it stole the land indigenous. My family came as refugees, but origins positioned us to get us in as citizens with all the legal benefits. We worked in sweatshops and started our own businesses. We left the tenements for suburban divisions in America. The violence of white militants, the willingness to murder people just because they're not citizens. New World Order's name of vigilance. The Minutemen's assembling on borders, building fences with ridiculous incentives for the businesses of war. Now the politicians' mission to imprison and deport. How can we witness this and hide behind defensiveness, denial, and indifference, as if the value of my life is somehow different, as if my privileges don't come from how the system is? I will not lose my senses in the white mist of ignorance, because I recognize the resilience in the eyes of today's immigrants as the same light that inspired my ancestors to fight for a freedom that is still in us. Shining with brilliance, I search for song within the silence, hear the whispers of clarinets and violins. My ancestors' guidance, memory, history, music humanizes. Amnesia. So there's over 11 million people in this country right now who don't have documents, papers. They don't have the little piece of paper, the permission to be here legally. And as a person who is a child of immigrants, a descendant of immigrants, of Hyman and Fanny who crossed over, in many ways, in very parallel circumstances, fleeing poverty, fleeing persecution, looking for opportunity, a safe place to make a life. What is my relationship to the 11 million folks who are here now, or the other folks around the world, fleeing Syria, fleeing Guatemala? Crazy violence. What do we do with this picture? There's been incredible amount of activism and advocacy from folks all over the country. This is a picture from Arizona. It's Puente Human Rights Movement, talking about not one more deportation. There are national and local organizations, the Dreamers, Culture Strike. There's all kinds of folks out there doing incredible work, organizing undocumented people, advocating in the political process. This is a question on the table, and we're in a political moment. Immigration has not emerged as one of the leading issues in the presidential campaign. Is that okay? And what is our role as citizens, as members of education, as students, as teachers, educators, right? What is our role? How do we talk about these narratives? How do we engage in the political process? What is our responsibility to these people? I have two little things to tell you. You can find more information about me, get in contact with me on my website. And I also have stickers. If anybody wants to take a sticker home, they're fun. And I want to end with this very short piece and then have a short Q&A. Because, you know, we've been on a journey, right? We've been traveling around all over the country, all over the world, through time, through looking at all of these different lenses. And it's complicated. It's really complicated. And I know I can feel overwhelmed, right? With the scope of it all. But when I really sit with myself and try to breathe and try to there's a certain way where it actually does get simple. I think about Hyman and Fanny fleeing the violence And I think about my family, the house that I live in, the safety that I feel. And there's an old tradition of welcoming the stranger into your home. Many faith communities hold that as an important value. So what does that mean? How do you practice that? Time is a circle. The past is not over. We look back so we can see forward. Family trees in a beautiful orchard. Community made of multiple cultures. We redefine a new world kosher. Love and justice a little bit closer. Build the bridges, break down the borders. Raise our children to stand on our shoulders. We're all made from the sparks of light. Divine shine in the darkest night. My heart stretches to hold us all precious. Every one of us at Harvard's life. It's time that we wake up and start to remember that we are the ones that can gather the embers, build a new fire to melt all the ice, share all the stories that memory ignites, dance in the flames as it reaches new heights, work with each other, protect human rights, repairing and healing the vessels unite, illuminate the world with our sparks of light. Thank you all very much for sharing this afternoon. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.